Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to a conversation with journalist and author Masha Gessen and Baruch Distinguished Professor John Brenkman. Masha Gessen began contributing to The New Yorker in 2014 and became a staff writer in 2017. Their most recent essays focus on Alexei Navalny, Trump's impeachment, Israel, Amanda Gorman, the Sackler legacy, trans kids, and those are only the essays published since January. Gessen's writing is incisive, compelling, and often deeply personal. It is, dare I say, the antidote to fake news. One of America and Russia's most influential public intellectuals, Gessen is the author of 11 books, including The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which won the National Book Award in 2017. Gessen has also contributed to the New York Review of Books and the New York Times. Masha Gessen is a distinguished writer in residence at Bard College and the recipient of a Guggenheim, Andrew Carnegie, and Neiman Fellowships, the Hitchens Prize, and the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Commentary. Masha, welcome to Baruch. We're so thrilled to be hosting you. It's also my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator for this evening's event, John Brenkman, a distinguished professor of comparative literature and English at the CUNY Graduate Center, where he coordinates the Critical Theory Certificate Program, and Baruch College, where he directs the US-Europe Seminar and has served as department chair and interim provost. John is widely admired as a colleague and teacher. The author of dozens of essays and numerous books, John's most recent volume is Mood and Trope, The Rhetoric and Poetics of Affect. He co-founded Social Text with Frederick Jameson and Stanley Aronowitz and served as founding editor. He has taught at many institutions across the United States and in France. John, thank you so much for serving as moderator for this event. Before we get started, let me share with you the run of show. John and Masha will be in conversation for approximately 45 minutes. Their conversation will be followed by a Q&A session prompted by you, our listeners and audience members. If you have a question, please type it into the chat function that you will see at the bottom of your screen. You do not have to wait until the Q&A session has started to submit your question. In fact, better to submit them as inspiration strikes. My colleague, Karina Pasquesi, will be receiving your questions and comments, and at the conclusion of the conversation, we'll read selected questions and comments aloud for Masha and John to respond to and reflect on. Please note that normally we would invite a bookseller to an event like this to help support our distinguished authors and also support the small business owner we work with. Alas, these are not normal times, so in lieu of our standard practice, we emailed everyone who RSVP'd a list of independent New York City bookstores where you might purchase Masha and John's books if you're interested. Thank you for supporting local businesses and local authors during these challenging times. Lastly, I want to acknowledge and thank our two sponsors for this event, the Wasserman Jewish Studies Center and my colleagues Andrew Sloan and Karina Pasquesi, and the English department, and my colleague and chair, Tim Aubrey. Thank you again for joining us. John, Masha, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. And
thank you, Jessica.
First of all, thanks to the Wasserman Jewish Studies Center for organizing this event and being able to bring Masha Gessen to campus. I'm sorry, it's not physically to campus, but we are much looking forward to this conversation. And thanks to Andrew Sloan, co-director of the Jewish Studies Centers, as well as Karina Pasquesi, who has done much to organize this event. Given the time, we're going to dive right in. Masha, your most recent book, fantastic title, Surviving Autocracy, came out in 2020. I actually read this book after the election, after January 6th, and after the inauguration. The book itself covers basically, I think, the first three and a half years of the Trump presidency, and does so with such exactness that I must say it's sort of the experience of reliving those years. One of the things that so struck me was that, provocative though the title may be, you were extremely scrupulous in your use of terminology. Autocracy is not something you deploy as a polemical label, but as a description and an analysis of behavior, of possibilities, and of dangers. Of Trump himself, you most often say he's involved in, it's a phrase of yours, an autocratic attempt. And for many of your readers, or might well be, have been predisposed to think that the key contrast or the key point of comparison you wanted to make was to Vladimir Putin. But very early on in the book, and I just want to cite this one sentence, you say, of all the autocrats who attract Trump's affection, only Putin has captured the American imagination. Rather, he has become a crutch for the American imagination. And I wonder if we might start there for you to elaborate on that, and because I think it has to do with how you perceive American public sphere, the relationship between Russia and the US, as well as Trump's own particular mindset.
Thank you, John. Thank you, and thank you, Jessica, for that great introduction. It's an honor to be here and to be in conversation with you. So thank you for that question. Obviously, I'm referring to having some weird feedback. In fact, somebody else's voice in my ear. Is there somebody with a mic not muted? Sorry. Okay, it seems to be gone. So I think there are a couple of different ways of thinking about Donald Trump, and by far the most compelling for much of his presidency for a lot of Americans was this idea that he was somehow alien to this whole culture, to this whole political structure, and he probably came from outer space, or at least was somehow installed by Russia. And I think that that's a way, I mean, it's one of the starkest symptoms of the conspiracy thinking that the Trump presidency fueled on both the right and the left. And I think we understand the conspiracy thinking on the right much better because we've probably thought about it more, and it's easier to see from the outside. And it is. I'm not trying to draw any false equivalencies here. It's terrifying, and it most recently drove the insurrection. But conspiracy thinking, and here's where it gets very tricky when I talk about this with my students, when we talk about truth in politics. I think conspiracy thinking can even coexist with an actual conspiracy, and it's still always bad. It's still always a way of thinking that is focused not on what is in front of us, what is actually a part of our shared reality, what can be used to build politics, because we can be, because we can exchange experiences and views on a thing that we're observing together. It focuses instead on something that is by definition hidden, that cannot be described, but can only be revealed. That cannot be experienced together, but again, can only be sort of known as some sort of all-encompassing explanation. And that's where I think Vladimir Putin comes in. And I'm not claiming that Vladimir Putin has nothing to do with Trump. Trump admires him. There was clearly Russian interference in the election. We don't know whether it influenced the outcome of the election. But I wish we wouldn't spend much time thinking about it, because that's not what was important during the 4 years of the Trump presidency, and I don't think it's what's important now.
As I recall, Masha, even back in 2017, in the months or several months after the election, you were quite skeptical of press coverage speculating on Russian collusion and so on. If I recall, you put quite a bit of emphasis on the fact that that there weren't very many facts yet, and so on. And I'm wondering, in the long run of the various investigations and so on, where you've come out on that question. Then I'd like to sort of come back to the psychology of conspiracy thinking. But
right. I think that where I come out on that question. I think there was more there than I originally thought. But even after all the exhaustive investigations that we have seen, there's nothing that would allow us to understand whether and how Russian interference influenced the outcome of the election. And I would even go further, which is to say that even if it did, and we will never know whether it did simply because that's something that's impossible to measure, right? Especially with, if you recall, Trump won by 77,000 votes in 3 counties, right? But even if it did, what we learned from that experience is something, or what we ought to learn, is not something about Russia, but something about us. Because what Russia did in 2016 isn't much different from what it attempted to do in 2020 and what it had been doing for decades in the United States and other Western countries. And if it somehow finally collided or resonated with what was happening in American politics, it's something that we learn about American politics, not something that we learn about Russia.
I was quite struck with your use of the metaphor of a crutch of the American imagination. And in speaking of conspiracy thinking and so on, there's a way in which it's, if I understand you, you see it as almost inherently having that function, because it means you need an answer before you have the answer.
Right. That's a great way of putting it.
In order to think through your confrontation with an unpleasant or unknown or complicated political situation, and that this has kind of infiltrated our political analyses and rhetoric to a fairly large, to an important extent in these last several years.
I think that's a great way of putting it. I'm going to borrow that phrase from now on. I hope, if you don't mind, that yes, that you need an answer before you can have an answer.
Thinking about the events that unfolded after the narrative in your book, and it happened very fast. I know you wrote about some of this in the New Yorker, and I'm sure it's on your mind as it is in the rest of us all of the time. I noticed an interesting sort of shift, nuance that came in your first commentaries, almost on the day after the election, as Trump was already declaring he was the winner. And we had the first signs that he was not going to accept a loss in this election. Instead of that phrase that's through the book, the autocratic attempt, you said that he was attempting an autocratic breakthrough, and that phrase struck me. And going back to my original premise, you're usually quite exacting in your language and your distinctions, and you put other writers' words and phrases under a microscope quite frequently too. So maybe talk a little bit about that kind of next step, that next threshold that was passed as it unfolded all the way down to January 6th and after, as you see that now in retrospect.
So in using the terminology autocratic breakthrough, autocratic attempt, autocratic breakthrough, autocratic consolidation, I'm actually using the work of a Hungarian sociologist named Bálint Magyar, who is really my intellectual hero. He is, you use the word exacting in talking about my book, but my actual ambition in writing this little book, Surviving Autocracy, was to try to replicate the experience that I have reading his work, which is that I just feel like, of course, right? Like suddenly things that that seem to be in chaos come into order and are illuminated. And I don't mean that he connects the dots like a conspiracy theorist. I mean that he orders information in a way that that makes me exclaim, of course, right? It's not the sort of, oh, what a brilliant idea way of reacting to reading. It's always a kind of, oh, but of course, that's what I'm looking at. And now you have illuminated it in a way that I get it. So Magyar has done a lot of work. I first learned about his work from books that he wrote and edited about the mafia state. And so he pioneered this idea of the mafia state, writing about Hungary and also about Russia in the early 2000s and 2010s. And then he proceeded to write this amazing 1,000-page volume on post-communist regimes. And there he introduces this idea of the autocratic transformations that follow a lot of these regimes. Now, I should backtrack a little bit and talk about how he thinks about language, which is that his starting point is that in 1989, we started talking about Eastern Europe using the terminology of liberal democracy, partly because that's what we assumed was going to happen, because what else can happen? And it was the end of history, and partly because that's the language of political science. And he says, if you talk about a country or a regime in terms of whether it has freedom of the press, whether it has free and fair elections, well, you might learn that it doesn't have freedom of the press, and you might learn that it doesn't have free and fair elections, but what have you learned about the actual regime? Right? You can say, and this is, I'm quoting him, you can say that the elephant cannot swim, you can say that the elephant cannot fly, but you haven't described the elephant. And he argues, and I think very convincingly, that using the wrong language actually got in the way of understanding Eastern Europe for many, many years. And so he made it his project to create a new language. And when I was writing, my background is largely writing about Russia. And so when I was writing this book about Trumpism, I thought I'll borrow his words, because isn't that poetic justice to borrow the words from Eastern Europe in order to try to explain what's happening here? And then I realized that it wasn't just poetic justice. It was actually a model that could be used very productively to talk about what's happening here, and or what we were seeing, and so getting back to autocratic attempt, autocratic breakthrough, and autocratic consolidation, those are the three stages into which he divides sort of the coming of autocracy. Autocratic attempt is the stage when autocracy can still be reversed or prevented by electoral means. In other words, you can vote the aspiring autocrat out of office. Autocratic breakthrough usually happens during the autocrat's second term, which I should remind us, in the countries that he is describing, a lot of them wasn't contiguous with the first term, right? Viktor Orban was voted out of office the first time. The Kaczynskis were voted out of office the first time. And now they're back.
This is your way of reminding us that nothing has stopped yet, right? Nothing is in.
This is exactly my way of very unsubtly, yes, putting a point on it. And when they come back, they actually institute structural changes that will make it impossible to vote them out of office again. And after those structural changes happen, that's what autocratic breakthrough is. And then after autocratic breakthrough, autocratic consolidation begins, which is exactly what it sounds like, the consolidation of power, and in most cases money, in the hands of the autocrat. Not in all cases, because in Poland, for example, money doesn't seem to enter into it. So what I think was happening in the months between, or in the period between November 8th and January 6th, was Trump's attempted autocratic breakthrough. It failed, but it failed quite narrowly.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Very interesting. You mentioned the I think with reference to the question of lying, truth and lying in politics. You oftentimes refer to Hannah Arendt in that context, and she's an important reference point for me as well on a lot of these questions. But there was a moment in your book which really struck me, partly because of the kind of weird humor of it. You remind us of the fact that Trump was capable of lying about the weather. The weather being like the most common, the thing we most have in common if we're standing near one another in any context. He did it about the weather at his inauguration, and then probably most memorably in the hurricane that was going to hit Alabama, and so on. And what struck me about your analysis there, your commentary on that, was that it brought out the fact that events like that, which at the time, even as you reflect back on it, have the feeling of like, this is just ridiculous. This is ridiculous behavior, it's absurd, and so on. But the point you made, and I think very provocatively, I'm just going to quote you again very short. You say there's no defenses. You call Trump's lying a power lie or a bully lie. And you say there is no defense against this lie because the point of the lie is to assert power. And you gave some very interesting accounts of those early news conferences and press sessions with his press secretaries and so on, in which just really, bald falsehoods were being propagated, straight-faced, or even not even necessarily straight-faced sometime. And you suggest that the point of that kind of exercise, and it really has a point, is just to tell the audience, I have power, and therefore I'm going to lie. If I want to lie to you, I'll lie to you. As opposed to advancing an alternative truth. There's a sense in which the fact that it's a lie is a part of its power. That's a very scary moment in this economy of transactions between, in this case, the presidential power and the public.
Yes, and I think we're still, living in a public sphere, to the extent that we are living in a public sphere during the pandemic, that has been traumatized and badly injured by this, by the constant confrontation with the power lie over the course of 4 years. And the power lie is actually one of the ways in which I think that Trump and Putin are pretty similar. They do it very, very differently, but that's where I first started thinking about it, was actually when I was writing about Putin, because he would lie blatantly. He does it very differently from Trump temperamentally. He's not emotional. He sort of drowns you in bureaucratic language, but the pseudo facts that he throws out are just as false and absurd and provably absurd as what Trump does in his very flamboyant and emotional way. And I think that the point of that lie, and we saw that, as I mentioned, I sort of dissect in the book a few of those instances, starting with the inauguration and Sean Spicer's memorable press conference after the inauguration, when he was sent out to scream at reporters, right, and sort of and bully them with blatant lies, and then Kellyanne Conway on Chuck Todd saying alternative facts and repeating alternative facts, and there was a conversation between the times that she says the phrase alternative facts that's really interesting. That's actually a negotiation, because Chuck Todd says, well, wait a second, but that's like, you can't just lie. You can't call facts alternative. And she says, if you're going to talk like that, we're not going to be able to have a relationship. And she said this on national television, this is how it's going to work now. The White House is going to make absurd, obviously blatantly false statements, and the media are going to have to engage with them. And for the next 4 years, the media were trying to figure out how to engage with them. And there's no good way of engaging with them, right? You lose no matter what you do. It's like you're constantly, I think, the lying president is an existential threat to the media. So you're constantly in this dance with somebody whose very behavior and whose very speech is a threat to your existence. The more you reproduce it, the less of you there is. And yet you don't have a choice about reproducing because it has real life consequences, because this is the president. And I really think, I mean, I'm partly thinking about this today because I had this ridiculous thing happen today. You know, one of the things that happened during the Trump presidency is that we had this rise of pseudo experts, I think, and some of them on the left. And so I was contacted today by a public radio producer from a major American city who asked me to come on to an hour-long show with one of these people. And I wrote back saying, thank you for the invitation, but this person is not an expert, you know, in my area of research. They have absolutely no credibility. And so I can't, you know, I have a no-go list of exactly 2 names, and this is one of them, and I'm not going to go on the show. And the producer responded by saying, yes, you're not the first person to tell us this. Thank you, and we'll reach out to you another time. So these people know that they're bringing somebody on their show who's going to spread falsehoods. And their way of thinking about it is that, you know, they're also going to invite somebody who is perhaps less quotable, but more reasonable, and then they can have a conversation. And that's part of, I think, the 4-year Trumpian corruption of what in some ways was not a great media scene in the first place.
Interesting. We're going to talk more about the media in a second, but reading your book, I came across something that struck me as giving a very accurate rendition of the portrait of Trump and of Putin, for that matter, in your other work that you draw. And it actually comes from the 18th century. It's from the Federalist, anti-Federalist debates. And Cato, who was one of the writers from New York, who was opposed to the idea of a strong presidency, 4-year term, cabinet, etc. Quoting Montesquieu, he drew out a series of traits that he said would inevitably happen to this sort of presidency as it becomes more and more like a monarchy. Ambition with idleness, baseness with pride, the thirst of riches without labor, aversion to truth, flattery, treason, perfidy, violation of engagement, contempt of civic duties, but above all, the perpetual ridicule of virtue. And it's a kind of an amazing series of traits that were seen in the late 18th century as a kind of intrinsic danger of this kind of centralized power. I'm not arguing against the presidency here, but it's that that a lot of what this extraordinary period of the last 4 years has brought to light is, well, what Arendt called the fragility of democracy, which I think is something Americans have not generally understood historically. We have a kind of sense of a deep, long-standing stability of our political system, whereas it's undergone all manner of changes and disruptions and transformations. And that kind of losing the grounding under your feet was an experience that I think for many of us was unique to this period of the Trump presidency. Whereas, of course, hundreds of millions of people all over the world feel that trembling under their feet politically all of the time. I'd kind of like to shift a bit to, in a way, to your vocation. You're quite frequently referred to as a journalist and activist, and clearly, yeah, well, you can correct that. I'm not attributing it. This is one of those things where I've read it, so I can cite it. But seeing your facial reaction, it makes me all the more want to just pursue the question, because really what it led me to, I'd really like to hear you talk about how you understand the vocation of journalism, and you have practiced it in a variety of political and institutional contexts. In Russia at a very hopeful time, in Russia in a very dangerous time, in the United States, and in the United States in a very dangerous time, and under these very things. So the vocation of the journalist is something, and the ethic of the journalist is something that quite fascinates me, and I'd love to hear you talk about that from your own perspective and experience.
Okay, so thank you for that, first of all, but I should explain my facial expression. It has nothing to do with any kind of disdain for activism. It's quite the opposite. It's my admiration for activists and my embarrassment at being called an activist when I'm not one. There have been times in my life when I've been an activist, and I know what hard work it is and how much more commitment and stamina it requires than the way I normally spend my time and make money. The last time I was an activist was for about 6 months during the protests in Russia in 2011, 2012, when I was doing actual organizing and agitation. And the time before that was more than a decade earlier. Right? So that's why I don't like to be called a journalist and an activist. I do not think, contrary to what I think is very common opinion in this country, that activism and journalism are incompatible. I think they're perfectly compatible. In fact, I think they make for a great combination. I got my start in the gay press in the US in the 80s during the AIDS era. And the gay press was an activist press. And it was, I had the good and bad luck to work in that activist press during a time of its absolute flowering, which occurred because it was a matter of life and death to have that press, right? This was, I'm assuming a lot of the people in the audience are too young to have an idea of what it was like to not have access to reliable medical information, reliable public health information during a pandemic. And, the mainstream media were not covering the AIDS epidemic. You could not pick up the New York Times and read about the new promising treatment. Later that became possible, but certainly not early on, or even information about safe sex, right, which was a practice that was invented really in the gay community by a gay New York City physician, the great Joseph Sonnabend, who died recently in London. And that information had to be spread through the gay press, as did information about AIDS activism, as did information about treatments, as did sort of on a broader level, information about ways to think about living with that disease, with that pandemic. And so that was the highest order of activism that I've been fortunate enough to sort of be a small part of. And I've also been a journalist in a much more conventional venue. I was writing for weekly for the New York Times at the time when I was organizing in Russia. I was writing for the opinion pages, but there's the question of how do you combine being an activist with being a journalist? And I think that goes to the heart of what we talk about when we talk about objectivity in journalism, which is that when a great group of writers and thinkers came up with the idea of objectivity in journalism in this country about a century ago, they meant transparency. They meant that you should be able to read an article and understand how the information in the article was obtained, down to what kinds of questions were asked, who the sources were, how they were connected to this information, what the nature of their expertise was. This was a break with what had then, at that point, been traditional sort of authorial voice in American journalism. And it was modeled after scientific papers. The idea was that you should be able to replicate a reporting venture the same way that you can replicate a science experiment. And this is why we have all the conventions that we have about disclosing the writer's connection to the matter at hand, but also identifying, whether you talked on the phone or whether you talked by Zoom, and where this person was and what kinds of questions you asked, and how you got to your conclusion. That is objectivity, and I think that it is incumbent on anybody who's an activist and writing about a topic to disclose the nature and direction of their activism while writing. And objectivity is achieved. It is not, it is not our job to represent the imaginary two sides of every issue, which most issues have more than two sides.
Yes, that question of the imaginary two sides is a very interesting one. It reminds me of the debates that go on, I think, in political theory and also in literary studies. Sometimes that, it was sort of in 18th century England, I think, that like, there's a Tory position and a Whig position, right? That sort of evolved the idea that there are these sort of two positions between which lies the truth. And it leads to, it can easily lead to a very kind of serious misrepresentation of reality by simply assuming all of that premise that this is the outer parameters of what must be true. It's either a Whig truth or it's a Tory truth, and so you balance them out. By the same token, this sort of stronger sense of objectivity that you're referring to is something that's so important and so elusive in contemporary discourse, American discourse, with the proliferation of media and so on. And the one thing that strikes me very much about the kind of journalism you do, the two great books, which we want to make sure to mention, of the more recent ones, about Russia, The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, and then another book with a scary title, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaims Russia, or is reclaiming Russia. Those books and the Surviving Autocracy, what really strikes me there as the kind of journalistic rigor of them is that it's a question of your vigilance, right? There's very much an aspect of sort of being a witness to events. And it made me think that one of the things, whether it's the daily press or any other kind of more in-depth journalistic writing, that as readers that we depend on, is the fact that we rely on the journalists to see and hear what we can't see with our own eyes, and that's beyond our earshot. Right? We don't have those conversations. We don't have the presence at this or that event, and so on. And that's where the sort of integrity of the reporting becomes so absolutely important to the creation of what you oftentimes refer to via Arendt as that sort of common public space, or the commonness within the public space that allows one to then go on and debate the various issues. But it's just let me say, I think it's quite amazing the way in which you keep up that vigilance and that witnessing through these very complicated topics across two very large and crazy countries.
Thank you. That's a really lovely thing to say about my writing, because that's actually like what I'm trying to do. But I want to add something to the way that you're defining journalism, which is that yes, it's telling us something that happens out of sight or out of earshot, but that we believe is a part of our community.
Yes.
Right. And I think that that's something that's harder and harder to achieve in with the way that U.S. media is constituted now, and with this disappearance of local media, which is, when we talk about sort of the disasters befalling our public sphere, we tend to focus on social media and technology, and almost at the expense of focusing on what's disappeared, which is local media, which is that sense that that the media are creating community.
I've followed with alarm for several years now the continual disappearance of daily papers in smaller cities across the country, which historically or through the latter half of the 20th century have been an extremely important part of, I think, American political life, and also as the most important eyes on corruption in politics, because in a way, city government is one of the most easily corruptible forms of government because of the contracts and connections and so on that flow from it. And it's amazing how many historically quite interesting, local in that sense, papers have fallen by the wayside or have been kind of scooped up into more corporate kind of enterprises and so on. We're going to go to a Q&A session here momentarily. And anything else you'd like to add to the discussion from what's come up so far?
No, this has been really a joy. Of course, there was something that I wanted to pick up on earlier, and now I can't remember what it was. So maybe it will come up during the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And now we're going to take questions.
Thank you so much, Masha and John. I have a lot of great questions here for you. Is there a distinction to be made between Trump's attempts at autocratic breakthrough and other successful or unsuccessful attempts in other countries that had the backing of military or state security apparatuses, especially given the racial and class composition of much of the rank and file military in the US? At CUNY, we see how military recruiters prey on poor students of color, but does that reality make it harder for a racially reactionary autocrat to mobilize state forces?
That is a great question. And I think we don't have enough information at this point to answer that question. We're still just learning what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. And what we're learning is extremely disturbing, right? We're gradually learning more and more about the number of off-duty police officers and retired military who were taking part in that in the insurrection. But most disturbingly, there was a piece today, I think it was in the Times, it may have been the Washington Post, about 2 Capitol Police officers who also seem to have been somehow aiding the insurrectionists. Unfortunately, and this is, I'm just going to answer in very, very broad strokes because this is not my area of expertise, but also, as I said, I don't think we at this point know enough, right? But I wouldn't rush to make assumptions about the possibility that Trump or another white supremacist autocrat or aspiring autocrat would be able to use the military because the military, the majority of military recruits are people of color. The military is a command structure, and it's hierarchical, it's very top down. And what we're really asking is whether an aspiring autocrat like that in the United States could ever secure the support of military leadership. And I don't think it's impossible. It didn't happen, but I don't think it's a priori impossible, and I don't think that the makeup of the armed forces is any insurance against it.
Thank you. Our next question, does the term autocracy focus too much of our attention on personalities like Putin, Trump, etc., distracting from an analysis of systemic and ideological issues, e.g. the radicalization of the GOP?
That's also a great and very fair question. And I think that, that's a question that we actually have to keep asking ourselves constantly, like to what extent are we doing justice to analyzing the system, and to what extent are we justifiably focusing on the personality? I think this is a both end situation, because in some way or another, all of the many autocracies that we're observing right now around the world, they are personalized, right? They're generally speaking, again, with like the possible exception of Poland, sort of patronage systems that are focused on a single man, and that are hard to imagine without that man. And that in fact, they're all kind of these sort of concentric structures where if you remove the center, the structure will probably collapse. It will not be able to sort of reconstitute itself in the same shape without that center, which is very different from 20th century totalitarianisms, right? Which were really much less personified systems, even if they did have strong leaders. But of course, every one of those autocrats does create a system, and that system deserves to be analyzed as a system. Even Trumpism, as haphazard and chaotic as it was organized as a system. And it was mostly a money-making system, a system of destruction and corruption, but it had its traits as a system.
John, would you like to add anything?
Well, just, I mean, the other sort of twist on it in the Trump case is that, and it's a little bit behind the question, if I understood it, is and it's going to take us a while to have a very thorough analysis of this too, is what a large number of elected Republican officials bought into the election scandal, whatever we're going to call it, and so on. And that really deserves, I think, another level of analysis, because it's one thing to say, which is true, I think, that those Republican senators and congressmen who went along with this are, fundamentally craven. They're so fearful and so desirous of keeping their power that they haven't wanted to lose Trump's base in their next electoral, for their own electoral ambitions. By the same token, the phenomenon seems to go beyond that. It's beyond the pale of our discussion right now. I think it would lead us into all kinds of directions, but I think it's an important thing to think about, because it does have to do, I think, with Masha, with what you're talking about, is that at what point and how does a kind of strongman autocrat congeal a system around him that first of all keeps him in power, and secondly potentially can survive beyond his own rule.
All right, I'm going to read the next two questions together since they share an affinity. The most tragic outcome of the presidential election was the wide propagation of the big lie, which created the basis for the January 6th insurrection. What are your thoughts regarding the future role of the media and other public institutions in countering and/or neutralizing the big lie, especially as it is experienced and acted upon by those who still consider themselves among Trump's MAGA supporters and who are believers in QAnon? And then the second question reads, if someone lies to me, I'm offended. I think, how gullible or stupid do you think I am? Are people cool with being lied to, or are they simply unable to discern truth or detect falsehood? And in that case, how can education develop the ability to distinguish between truth and mendacity?
So let me start with the second question, because I think it refers back to the exchange that John and I had about the power lie. And the power lie, of course, goes to Arendt's description of totalitarian propaganda, which really is a way of sort of inviting people into an ideological construction in which they can no longer trust their own experiences, or they, I would say, voluntarily forfeit the ability or the responsibility to rely on their own experience, and they receive their new reality from the totalitarian leader. They can't get it anywhere else because it is not observable. It is dictated. So when Trump says, when I came out, when I started speaking during my inauguration, the rain stopped and the sun shone, that is not anything that anyone experienced. No one who was there, no one who was watching it on TV. So you can only receive that information from the totalitarian leader. And it's an absurd example, but a really telling one. And so, it's not that people are gullible. It's that people actually make that decision. They make the choice to join that bubble. Right? And again, Arendt writes about totalitarian ideology as something that is entirely encapsulated and that contains the tools for explaining anything that contradicts it away, right? So if you believe that everyone else is always lying about the weather, then if they say that here's the weather forecast or the weather record for yesterday and it says that it was raining all day, well, of course you would say that. You're with the lying press who are always telling us lies about the weather, and that, so that gets explained away, and you get to live within this encapsulated space. Now, the big lie and the role of the media. I mean, the media, of course, have a role. As I said earlier, we still have to have a reckoning with what happened to us and what we lost over the course of the 4 Trump years. And we have, this continues. You have Texas Governor Greg Abbott claiming that power went out in Texas because of the Green New Deal, and the Washington Post actually publishing a headline that says, Governor Abbott says, blames power outages on Green New Deal policies, semicolon, critics call the claims, quote, a lie, end quote, right? So a headline in which the lie is not in quotes, but the term lie, which is the truth, is in quotes, and you just want to punch your computer screen. So that sort of thing we have to reckon with. We have to reappraise. We have to figure out how we can continue going without the false equivalencies and the both sidism and all that. But that's not nearly enough. Right? A lot of this reckoning will take place in media that do not reach the people who are the biggest audience for the big lie. And you can't just sort of say to this the mainstream media, go and fix that, because what we actually have to fix is our public sphere. And in particular, if we're talking about media, what we have to fix is that we entrust the formation of our public sphere to a few profit-driven corporations whose responsibility is not to support democracy or to create democracy, but to make money for their shareholders. And somehow we keep trying the same thing over and over again, thinking that it will somehow miraculously succeed, even though their interests, the interests of the media, including the media where I work, do not actually fully coincide with the interests of democracy.
John, Would you like to add anything?
No, go ahead. I know we're getting short on time, and I think
Okay.
we have more questions. So
Yes.
let's hear from the audience.
Great. What is your assessment of the Putin-Navalny struggle? Do you think that Navalny will survive his current prison sentence? And if so, given Putin's control of the instruments of state power, is there any serious prospect that Navalny can prevail politically and wrest power from Putin and his oligarch enablers?
I'm not a fortune teller. I can't tell you whether Navalny will survive. I know that Navalny's life is very much in danger when he is in Putin's prisons. I know that Putin doesn't want him to come out of prison alive. Now, normally I would say, and if we were talking about anybody but Navalny at any time other than right now, I would say that's a silly question. Nobody can actually overthrow Putin except Putin himself, right? This is a self-contained, it's a black box of a regime that can only self-destruct. And of course, eventually it will self-destruct because they all do, right? But, and at that point, the structures that Navalny is building will offer an alternative. I think of his movement primarily as an investment in Russia's future, in a post-Putin future, but not as as a way of removing Putin. And yet, he has certainly found ways to subvert, or I would say hack, all three of the ways in which Putin holds on to power. And that's really extraordinary. Putin holds on to power by dominating the information sphere, and by basically having damaged having dismantled the electoral system and created a kind of system of false legitimacy that that allows him to hold on to power. And Navalny has subverted those things. His latest, the last video that he released before going to prison was watched by a majority of the adults in Russia. Putin no longer dominates the information sphere in Russia. Navalny is his actual rival in that field, right? And he has also figured out a way to sort of hack the false legitimacy system by creating a way of an approach to Russia's fake elections that actually pose a challenge to Putin's people. So I think there's a non-negligible chance that his movement will actually prove effective, even in shortening Putin's reign.
All right, John, did you want to offer any final comments?
No, except I was very happy for that last question, because it was the issue that I didn't get time to get to in our in our conversation, and I think that one of the things that really strikes me, Masha, about your approach to that, you're saying you can't predict the future, of course, but it also has to do with the fact, goes back to this question of the vocation and ethic of journalism as you practice it, which is that it is, though, maybe a matter of, and if you could give me a short answer to this, telling us, in this case, with what's unfolding in Russia, what should we watch for? Because the American public, and even those of us that try to be fairly up to date, it's a difficult thing to follow Russian politics. So and have a feel for it. So what should we be watching for in the coming months, the coming year, in light of what's going on and the demonstrations that occurred and so on?
I think there's reason to watch Russian elections, which I believe are happening in September, and that's something new, because certainly there has been no reason to watch any elections for most of the last 20 years. But they have become, partly because of what Navalny has done, a stress point for the regime. And so that's, that may be a moment that's at least informative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, John and Masha, for being here tonight and having this conversation. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time to attend the webinar as well. And I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. And please, if you'd like to purchase John and Masha's books, please consult the list of independent booksellers in New York that we'd love to support. Thank you again for everything.
Thank you very much.